I opened the envelope on the kitchen counter, my hands steady despite the flutter of unease in my chest. My name, Lenora Whitfield, 65 years old, was neatly printed on cream cardstock, embossed with gold the invitation to my daughter Zoe's engagement party, a Gold Coast venue, of course crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and a guest list carefully curated for status and social recognition. I set the envelope down and studied it for a long moment, tasting the mix of pride and apprehension that always surfaced whenever I entered their world. Zoe had grown up surrounded by wealth and privilege, friends who had no time for subtlety or kindness. I could almost hear their whispers. Who let her in or just staff? Isn't she? They had never understood the woman I had become outside of their narrow expectations. I remembered last year's luncheon, the quiet way my accomplishments were dismissed as helpful hobbies by Alexander and his friends. The sting hadn't dulled with time, yet there was something else, a quiet determination that refused to let fear dictate my steps. I had built a life in Chicago on my own terms, quietly saving struggling businesses, mentoring ambitious young women, and carving out a career that required every ounce of wit, patience, and precision I had. I picked up the invitation again, running my finger over the embossed letters. Tonight would be different, I told myself. The drive to the Gold Coast felt heavier than usual, but I braced for the evening ahead. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I slid into the driver's seat of my car, the city lights reflecting off the windshield. Tonight would test more than etiquette. The moment I pulled away, I realized there was no turning back. The mirror reflected a woman who had learned to mask tension with elegance. I adjusted the cuff of my tailored black blazer, smoothing the fabric over my forearm as if the gesture could straighten the unease knotting my stomach. Zoe's friends would arrive soon, each of them trained in the subtle art of scrutiny, the sort of social observation sharpened by years of privilege. I had watched them before small smirks, tilted eyebrows, glances that assessed everything from the cut of a sleeve to the timbre of a voice. Alexander appeared in the doorway, a glass of whiskey in hand, as if the evening were a rehearsal for his own amusement. His eyes flicked over me briefly, the faint smirk he always wore curling at the edges. "You're sure that outfit is appropriate," he said lightly, the tone calibrated to amuse his friends while reminding me of my place. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, a quiet refusal to rise to the bait, as I packed my clutch with Essentials phone, wallet, the discreet folder of notes on Zoe's engagement logistics. I thought of the hours spent restructuring small businesses, negotiating contracts, and untangling problems that had left larger consulting firms baffled. None of it mattered here. My accomplishments, my diligence, the tangible impact of my work completely invisible to this social circle. I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar steadiness that came from years of mastering crises in boardrooms and back offices alike. The veneer of calm I had perfected for decades now served me not for concealment, but for readiness. Each slight, each whispered assessment only hardened my resolve. I slid into the back seat of the waiting car, the driver nodding politely, unaware of the storm waiting to enter the Gold Coast. My reflection in the tinted window stared back, poised, precise, and quietly determined as the city lights began to blur. Tonight demanded more than composure. It demanded strategy. The valet opened the car door, and the polished marble of the Gold Coast venue gleamed under the evening lights. I stepped out, heels clicking softly against the stone as I carried myself with measured grace, every movement precise, practiced. Guests arrived in clusters, laughter spilling across the entryway, champagne flutes catching the light. I could feel the subtle scrutiny in their eyes before they even noticed me. Zoe's friends in sleek dresses, whispering among themselves. Glancing at my ensemble with the faintest traces of amusement, I approached the registration table. Confident, despite the tightening in my chest, a young attendant, polished and professional, handed me a badge. I read the name slowly, letting it register Lenora Whitfield, housekeeper. The word hung in the air, sharp and public. As Zoe's friends stiffened and exchanged small, satisfied smirks, their voices rose just enough to carry across the lobby. "Oh, she's just staff tonight." I held the badge in my hand. Its cream cardstock thick, gold lettering elegant but damning. I clipped it to my jacket with deliberate calm. No chair had been reserved for me at the main table. No plate of hors d'oeuvres awaited my presence. Every subtle exclusion, every glance of disregard, confirmed that this was orchestrated, a spectacle to assert hierarchy and diminish me inside. I walked past the throng of guests who mistook my silence for submission. Each step was deliberate, measured. The laughter and whispers brushed against me, but they did not penetrate. I kept my composure, masking the surge of humiliation, turning inward to the long years of skill, resilience, and strategic thinking that had brought me to this point. Their perception of me was small, limited. What they could not see were the capabilities and judgment honed quietly over decades. I placed my hands lightly on the table edge as I surveyed the room. The empty chair at the head table glaring in contrast to the carefully seated social elite. This orchestrated slight, meant to diminish, instead sharpened my focus. Each smirk, each whispered insult was fuel, a reminder of the power I had earned quietly while they clung to appearances. I exhaled slowly, allowing the calm exterior to settle over the churning storm within. The badge was meant to define me, to erase me from the celebration. Instead, it had drawn a line, one I intended to cross on my own terms. Tonight, every subtle dismissal would be catalogued, every misjudgment noted. The crowd saw a quiet, composed woman. Beneath that surface, a mind was already calculating the reversal. The engagement party continued around me, unaware that the evening spectacle had just become the opening act of a much larger reckoning. The soft murmur of conversation washed over me as I adjusted my blazer, the housekeeper badge pinned neatly to the lapel. I felt every pair of eyes that flicked toward me, a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed judgment. Alexander, leaning casually near the hors d'oeuvres, offered a tight-lipped smile that barely concealed amusement at the scene unfolding. He believed I would shrink into my designated role, quietly endure the orchestrated humiliation, and exit unnoticed. I raised my hand subtly to my left, fingers brushing the cool metal of my engagement ring, a symbol that had long represented compromise and expectation rather than partnership. Slowly, deliberately, I slid it from my finger, the weight of the 2-carat diamond warm against my skin for the last time. The movement was quiet but precise, performed with the same care I had once reserved for managing corporate negotiations or delicate restructuring plans. A sudden silence rippled through the immediate space. Zoe's friends glanced at one another, the smirk on one young woman's face faltering. Alexander's confident posture shifted. His smirk faded into a blink of disbelief. Guests paused mid-bite. The clink of a champagne flute halted mid-air. The small crowd nearest to me sensed a change, an unexpected assertion that contrasted sharply with the submissive role I had been assigned moments before. I placed the ring gently on the marble table at my side, letting the soft click echo faintly in the room, more audible than any words could have been. It was a gesture loaded with meaning, silent but unmistakable. I was no longer complicit, no longer bound by the expectations designed to diminish me. The badge labeled me staff. The absent chair marked me as lesser, but this act reclaimed the authority that had always been mine. Alexander's eyes widened, scanning the table, the guests, and finally resting on me with a mixture of incredulity and dawning realization. My calm exterior never wavered. Even as the internal satisfaction surged, this small, deliberate gesture shifted the perception of power in the room. The chatter began to resume, but the tone had changed. The calculated equilibrium that had favored the social elite had been subtly disrupted. I turned, shoulders squared, moving through the crowd with measured poise. The evening continued around me, but the moment was mine. No words were necessary. The ring lay on the table, silent, resolute, and definitive, a quiet declaration that I would no longer tolerate invisibility or humiliation. As the engagement chatter swirled around me, I allowed my mind to drift, not in escape, but in quiet calculation. Years of experience had honed me in ways these social elites could never perceive. I remembered the late nights poring over spreadsheets for struggling Chicago restaurants, the sleepless hours negotiating with creditors while recalibrating failing operations. Every deal salvaged, every balance sheet restored, had been quietly achieved without fanfare or recognition. I had restructured Hawthorne Foods' subsidiary 3 years ago, a project that had many consultants shaking their heads in defeat. By analyzing production inefficiencies, renegotiating supplier contracts, and implementing strategic marketing shifts, I had saved the company from bankruptcy and preserved over 200 jobs. The people who now whispered about me at this engagement would never know the sleepless nights, the delicate balance of diplomacy and decisiveness, the long hours spent ensuring families could keep roofs over their heads. My own consulting work had started modestly, a $5,000 investment and a dining room table. Yet within a year, I had rescued failing bakeries, steakhouses, and small manufacturers, expanding each business enough to secure steady employment for countless employees. Every number I corrected, every mismanaged fund I recovered, was a testament to skill that Alexander chose to ignore, that the social circle refused to recognize. I glanced down at my hands, remembering the precise care with which I had folded shirts, prepared documents, and managed the household tasks that had earned derisive smirks at parties, but were merely extensions of the meticulous discipline that fueled my professional success. They had reduced me to appearances and etiquette, unaware that beneath the calm exterior lay decades of strategic thinking, financial intelligence, and an unyielding sense of integrity. The juxtaposition of their perception and reality sharpened my focus. I was invisible in their eyes, yet armed with capabilities they could neither comprehend nor counter. Every small whisper, every pointed glance, reinforced the quiet truth I had lived for decades. My competence and foresight were mine alone, and they could never take that from me. Tonight, that hidden strength was no longer background. It was the foundation upon which I would reclaim control, wield authority, and assert the value they refused to acknowledge. The skills I had nurtured quietly for decades were about to become the leverage I had always known I possessed. Back in the quiet of my Lincoln Park apartment, the hum of the city outside felt distant, irrelevant to the calculations running through my mind. The evening's engagement party had passed, but the sting of deliberate exclusion lingered, sharpening my focus. Every glance, every smirk, every whispered comment from Alexander's circle had been noted. Tonight would not end as it had begun. I spread documents across the glass dining table, each folder containing meticulous records, financial statements, contracts, correspondence evidence of misappropriated funds, embezzlement, and deliberate mismanagement. My mentor, Margaret Brennan, a former federal prosecutor, had taught me to build a case with precision, anticipating every counter-argument and loophole. She had emphasized patience, strategic timing, and clarity of presentation. I followed her advice like a blueprint. Across from me, James Fitzgerald, a former forensic analyst now working as my trusted assistant, sorted spreadsheets and cross-referenced statements. Every figure confirmed the discrepancies I had quietly documented over the years. Together, we mapped a path to public vindication, subtle, calculated, and undeniably impactful. Alexander's hubris had blinded him to the consequences of underestimating me. I traced lines between transactions, highlighting patterns of misconduct that aligned with Alexander's habitual disregard for rules and ethics. Margaret's voice echoed in my mind, reminding me that justice could be administered without theatrics. But timing was everything. This wasn't about revenge for its own sake. It was about asserting authority, reclaiming dignity, and ensuring that those who had tried to diminish me could no longer manipulate perception or power. Every step was deliberate. The evidence had to be airtight. The social impact carefully timed. The reveal undeniable. I anticipated the ripple effect through the engagement party guests, Alexander's family, and the broader social circle. Each whisper that had mocked me would be replaced with recognition of my skill, composure, and authority. As I reviewed the final checklist, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every anticipated reaction had been accounted for. The night of humiliation had become a catalyst, transforming indignity into a strategic advantage. The files were ready. The plan was precise, and the execution depended only on patience and timing. The city lights of Chicago glimmered against the dark sky as I leaned back in my chair, letting the tension ease into determination. Tonight, the first act had ended. Soon, the true story would unfold. The next morning, Lenora sat at her home office desk, reviewing the files once more. Alexander's habitual arrogance had left traces: emails, invoices, and casual remarks that, to the untrained eye, appeared inconsequential, but each one was a thread in a pattern. And tonight, those threads would be woven into a picture they could not ignore. She began with small, precise moves: a brief, anonymous tip to the company auditor, highlighting discrepancies in expense reports, a careful conversation with a mutual friend who had influence over social circles, planting seeds of awareness without exposing her hand. James Fitzgerald monitored the reactions as she expected. Every whispered remark that reached Alexander or his friends, every subtle shift in their demeanor, was cataloged and stored. Lenora felt a quiet satisfaction as she saw the first hints of uncertainty creep into their confident facades. They assumed she remained the quiet, compliant figure of last night, oblivious to their schemes. In reality, she was a step ahead, every move deliberate, every observation purposeful. Zoe's friends noticed it first, the subtle lift of her chin as she entered a room, the calm command of her tone during casual conversation. They exchanged fleeting looks, unsure whether to be impressed or unsettled. Alexander, meanwhile, began to notice a change. He could not place an ease in Lenora's composure that suggested she was no longer entirely predictable. The careful planting of evidence and whispers set the stage. Alexander's colleagues and social peers started perceiving the faintest hints of discrepancy in his usual control. Though they could not yet articulate it, Lenora's internal satisfaction grew as she watched the balance shift imperceptibly but irrevocably. Each social maneuver, each strategic observation, built anticipation. The engagement party was approaching, the room for public vindication looming. Even as she folded letters and closed secure folders, Lenora's mind mapped the evening to come. Timing would be everything. Small moves had been executed. Trust was tested. Perceptions subtly altered. The confidence that had seemed invisible last night now shimmered faintly, recognizable only to those paying attention. She rose, smoothing the fabric of her blazer, her posture immaculate. Every detail had been considered, every contingency prepared. Alexander remained unaware, the social elite oblivious, yet the undercurrents of change were already moving through the room. Invisible yet inexorable, Lenora felt the surge of quiet triumph that came before action. Tonight, everything would converge. The Crystal Gardens ballroom shimmered under the glow of chandeliers as Lenora entered, her heels clicking softly against the marble. Conversations paused. Glasses paused mid-air, as heads subtly turned to measure her. The housekeeper badge was still pinned to her blazer, a silent reminder of the orchestrated humiliation from the previous evening. But tonight, it would serve a different purpose. She walked past Zoe's friends, who had gathered in clusters, their laughter faltering as they noticed the calm precision in her steps. Alexander lingered near the head table, the smirk on his face taut with tension. He had expected compliance, perhaps embarrassment, but Lenora's poise challenged every assumption. At the check-in table, she paused to adjust the badge, the gold lettering catching the ambient light. Lenora Whitfield, housekeeper. The words gleamed in defiance, not submission. A few guests whispered, uncertain, and she allowed a small, deliberate smile to cross her lips. They had tried to diminish her, to render her invisible. But the control had shifted. The humiliation they had meticulously planned now emphasized her quiet authority instead. Approaching the main table, she noted the empty chair, intended to mark her absence. Instead, she stood beside it, upright and commanding attention without a word. Alexander's confident posture faltered for the briefest moment. A flicker of recognition crossed his eyes. The guests began to sense the reversal. Whispers circulated. The woman they had mocked now dominated the room without raising her voice. Lenora's composure never wavered. She allowed her gaze to sweep the room, acknowledging Zoe's friends and Alexander's circle, signaling silently that she was no longer the person to be dismissed. The subtle weight of her presence overturned the hierarchy they had imposed, replacing it with quiet authority. Every step, every measured gesture, carried the unspoken assertion, the judgment, the mockery, the intended humiliation. All of it had failed. She had reclaimed the narrative, commanding attention and respect without overt confrontation. The ballroom resumed its murmurs and clinking of glasses, but the balance had irrevocably shifted. Alexander's smirk had vanished, replaced by an unreadable expression. As the social elite realized the person they had intended to diminish was the one in control, Lenora stood tall, the housekeeper badge gleaming in the chandelier light, a testament to resilience and authority. While the orchestrators of her humiliation faced the consequences of underestimating her presence, the engagement party had ended, but the ripple of change lingered in Lenora's mind. She no longer felt the weight of imposed roles or the need to accommodate others' judgments. The housekeeper badge, once a symbol of derision, now rested in her desk drawer, a reminder of the moment she reclaimed authority. Zoe approached her later, hesitant yet seeking guidance. Lenora listened as her daughter spoke of ambition, trust, and the pressures of navigating social expectations. with calm clarity. Lenora offered advice not just about etiquette or appearances, but about integrity, decision-making, and recognizing the people who truly mattered. Each word strengthened Zoe's confidence while reinforcing Lenora's own sense of purpose. In the days that followed, Lenora's influence grew quietly but unmistakably. Friends, colleagues, and even Alexander began to recognize that she operated on a level they had long ignored. Every interaction, every choice, reflected a woman who no longer sought approval but demanded respect by merit. Lenora understood that empowerment was not a single act, but a sustained presence, a balance of poise, intellect, and moral authority. She had transformed humiliation into leverage, invisibility into visibility, and doubt into conviction. Through mentorship, strategy, and unwavering self-respect, she had created a life defined by her own terms, a sphere of influence that extended beyond family ties, proving that dignity and authority could be earned and sustained. Weeks after the engagement, Lenora sat by the window of her Lincoln Park apartment, sunlight spilling across her desk. The empty chair from that night remained in her mind not as a mark of exclusion, but as a symbol of the space she had claimed for herself. It reminded her that opportunity could emerge from humiliation, and that dignity was something she could define on her own terms. Her mentorship of Zoe continued, guiding her daughter through professional choices and social navigation with clarity and patience. Colleagues and friends began to seek her counsel, recognizing the combination of insight, experience, and steady judgment that had always been hers. Alexander and the social circle had underestimated her, and that miscalculation had transformed into enduring influence. Lenora reflected on the years of quiet labor, resilience, and strategic thinking that had built the life she now commanded. Every challenge, every slight, had contributed to a strength she had learned to wield without aggression, proving that empowerment was as much about consistency and presence as it was about decisive action. The city outside thrummed with life, but inside, Lenora felt a calm authority. The path she had forged, the legacy of dignity and leadership, was hers entirely. When those who underestimated her finally saw her true power, she would already be moving forward, unshaken and unstoppable.